Savage Psychotherapist here. Welcome to episode 1 of the Trauma Preparation Skills Training Series. Today will be the first episode. I got to go through some source information first. I'm going to throw out some names of some materials and some authors, and a lot of these people have a lot of real world experience. I'm going to talk a little bit about trauma, what trauma is clinically, as far as on the diagnostic and statistical manual. There are other things that people can experience in life that might elicit similar symptom reactions and chronic issues, but they might not technically be clinical trauma. I'm not going to get into things like weird made-up terms like micro traumas, nor am I going to get into the gross overuse of the word trauma. It's not part of this series. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about epidemiology and some data on how prevalent trauma is, what the most common types of traumatic events are that people experience. And then I'm going to get into the first skill. Some of the sources that I'm going to cite, obviously work by like Dave Grossman and his writings on killing, on combat, presentations that he's given to military law enforcement personnel, etc. Other books like Warrior Mindset by Michael Askin. One of my favorite books is a book called Tough by Greg Everett. That's definitely worth a read. I have to talk about Richard Tedeschi and his study and research with posttraumatic growth amongst trauma survivors. Things like Sharpening the Warrior's Edge by Bruce Seidel, Gift of Fear by Gavin de Becker, Violence of Mind by Varg Freeborn. There's some other people that obviously are definitely in the periphery of dealing with traumatic events and resiliency, like James Stockdale of Stockdale Paradox fame. And obviously this is informed by my education with things like cognitive processing therapy, prolonged exposure therapy. I have a slide on this presentation that I used to teach that basically says, I can't make any of this make sense to you. This is stuff that you're going to experience or you're going to be exposed to, and you can make utilization of it or you can't. But when I said I would break these things down, there's only a certain level of that I can do, but I can just show you. You're going to have to be able to find a way to incorporate this stuff into your life. So to talk a little bit about psychological trauma, I'm going to talk about it from the point of view of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. Technically, in order to be diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder, a person has to experience something that we call a Criterion A event. And that is experiencing any type of event that happens to you, that happens to somebody else, and you see it happen with your own eyes, or something that you learn about happening to a close friend or family member. That distinction is important. Involving death, serious bodily harm, sexual violence. In the events of learning of the death of a friend or family member, that death had to have been violent or accidental. It's not like a natural type of thing. Unless it was due to like a natural disaster, like they were killed in a tsunami or a hurricane or a tornado or an earthquake. I always take a moment to talk about sexual violence. When you hear the word violence, there's some things that come to your mind, like injury, physical pain, tissue damage. And there are a lot of sexual violations that don't involve any of that, and it's still traumatic, right? So I think they should have used the word sexual violation instead of violence, but that's just a personal opinion. There are other categories of traumatic events like exposure to not necessarily things with your own eyes, but maybe seeing something happen in a recorded video or like a live feed. So say you're a military drone operator or intelligence personnel and you're looking at something that's happening live from 7,000 miles away, and it's a traumatic event like a bomb strike, or maybe there's civilian casualties or something like that. Same with watching video recordings of things like that. You know, maybe you're a police detective and you have to look at video surveillance footage of somebody being violently attacked or somebody experiencing some kind of child abuse or domestic violence, or a nanny cam or something like that where you're watching somebody be abused or neglected. In those situations where you're watching something, a video recording or a digital feed, in order for that to qualify as a traumatic event according to the DSM, that has to be done as part of your job. You don't have a choice but to look at this material. But that's the criterion A as far as traumatic events are concerned. You have to experience something like that in order to be diagnosed with PTSD. You could consider lots of things traumatic. You can go through things like a divorce, and it can change your entire worldview, the way that a traumatic event will change somebody's whole worldview. But you couldn't be diagnosed with PTSD for something like going through a divorce. There had to have been something else going on, like you had to have been beaten severely by your estranged spouse, just like, I don't want to be with you anymore, here's divorce papers, we've had a good run, but I'm leaving. That's not trauma clinically. That's a thing that I'll stand by. I don't think our society and our culture should shift and soften that up. I think that should stay where it is. People will experience potentially traumatic events, PTE. Experiencing a potentially traumatic event and experiencing some post-traumatic stress-based symptoms does not constitute a mental disorder. What that is a normal reaction to an abnormal situation. If you do experience something traumatic, clinically traumatic or otherwise, and you do experience some kind of a reaction, like an acute reaction, nightmares, flashbacks, hypervigilance, avoiding things, mood changes, in the aftermath of that, that doesn't constitute a mental disorder, and it shouldn't be pathologized. That's a normal reaction to an abnormal situation. So generally speaking, amongst trauma experiencers, the rate of PTSD diagnosis is about 8%. So if you think about 100 people experiencing a criterion A traumatic event, 8 of those people are probably going to suffer from some kind of chronic PTSD. So what does that tell you? Most people don't end up with post-traumatic stress disorder after they experience something traumatic. What most people actually do is experience a thing called natural recovery, where they integrate that experience into their life, they live with the memory, they maybe learn some information, make some changes in their life, but they otherwise have a pretty healthy view of themselves, the world, and other people, and they're able to kind of bounce back or continue on. Most people experience a thing called natural recovery. There's Rex, my dog. He's making some snorts and some noises down here. I'm going to talk about the epidemiology of trauma and how prevalent it is. There was a World Mental Health Survey Consortium in 2016, went around and surveyed 24 countries, 68,000 respondents. Out of those 68,000 respondents, they identified 29 different types of potentially traumatic events, PTE types. The exposure rate, 70%. About 70 to 80% of people in the Western world, according to this survey, that's a lot of people. So if you think about it, the weather report saying there's a 70 to 80% chance of rain, that might change your behavior. You might grab an umbrella, you might grab a rain jacket. But if I told you that in the Western world, there's about a 70 or 80% chance that you'll experience something traumatic at some point in time in your life, people don't really pay much attention to that. They hope it doesn't happen, or they, go, yeah, that's other people. The prevalence rate of traumatic events is high. That tells us a couple of different things. People are not as fragile as we like to think. They're tougher than we give them credit for. And yeah, that means you. And number two, why wouldn't we still want to do something to prepare for traumatic events? 30% of those 70,000 people experienced 4 or more themselves. You got to think of a military veteran who goes on multiple deployments, especially in recent decades, probably experienced dozens of traumatic events, depending on what their job was and what they were doing and that kind of stuff. Okay, so over 50% of the potentially traumatic events reported, over half of them were these 5 things. And the number one that happens the most often to people is witnessing death or life-threatening injury happen to somebody else. Seeing somebody get seriously hurt or killed in a car accident. Seeing death or life-threatening injury happen to somebody else. Number 2 would be the unexpected death of a loved one. Boy, if that doesn't inform you about what you should do with your relationships. One of the skills that I come up with, it's not one of my 24, this is kind of like a little bonus skill, goes along the lines of, if you knew that the unexpected death of a loved one was one of the most commonly experienced traumatic events, you might do things to ameliorate future regret, like not spend all your time on this when you're husband or wife is around, or when your kids are around, because there's only so much time, and when it's gone, it's gone. A lot of times people will lose someone and they will think, man, where'd all the time go? Well, just make sure it's not going to places like this so that you don't have to live with that regret if you ever do experience the unexpected death of a loved one. The third one, being mugged, attacked, or physically assaulted. I got some skills that are associated with that. Number 4, being in a life-threatening vehicle accident. And that never happens, right? Like car accidents? Nah, that never happens. Yeah, right. Probably in the time that I've been talking, there's probably been 50 car accidents on Oahu. Those are the most common things that people will experience if they do experience trauma in their life. And here I'm going to now expose you to skill number 1, and this comes out of research by Richard Tedeschi. Richard Tedeschi has studied trauma survivors, a lot of military combat veterans, but not exclusively, others as well, for decades. And one of the things that he's picked up on is if you listen to people's trauma stories, a lot of people experience some type of relatively permanent positive transformative growth as a result of that they wouldn't have experienced otherwise. So skill 1 is for you to learn about and understand post-traumatic growth. And what he found, there are these 5 main areas where people experience some type of growth. One is a newfound appreciation of life. Maybe they realize how precious life is. They realize how valuable their time is. They enjoy aspects of life, even though they know life can be difficult and challenging and can be painful sometimes, especially if it was like a near-death experience or they saw somebody else almost experience a near-death situation. Another one is personal strength, getting through something traumatic or dealing with the aftermath and the chaos that follows it and realizing how strong they were. Never having known how strong they could be until they were tested in that manner. So developing some new sense of personal strength. Maybe they learn that they can rely on themselves more. Another is like new possibilities. Maybe they develop new interests. Maybe they were attacked violently and thought they were going to be killed because somebody had a knife or a gun. They didn't use it. They just decided to rob them and attack them. But maybe in the aftermath of that person was like, you know what? I'm going to learn jujitsu. And so they develop a new interest, and that's a new possibility. Like, hey, maybe I can learn how to have more skills that I could then use to potentially defend myself. Maybe they develop new perspectives on things. Maybe they realize that, they can adapt to situations. Sometimes after people experience a traumatic event, they experience improved relationships. So you can imagine how something like that might help you not take things for granted that you maybe used to take for granted. Say you lose a child, but you still have surviving children. That might change your relationships with them. You might hold them a little closer and treat those relationships with a little more importance, a little more intent than you did before. And that doesn't mean that you were bad before, but that just means that your relationships improve. And another one is developing some kind of spiritual, philosophical, religious, or existential growth. That's the first skill in the series. Some background information and the first skill. The first skill is orienting you toward post-traumatic growth. Going to move on to the next one. Savage Psychotherapist, out.